Well, I've titled this sermon, I'm not sure what I've titled it actually. I think I put Stepping Out of the Shadows. And you're probably thinking, what on earth does that mean? You're not going to get all weird on me, are you? But the reason why I came to that conclusion is as I was sort of reading Timothy, and we'll talk about him in a moment, where Paul is sort of charging him to say, come on, come out of the shadows yourself. Be the man who God intended you to be. I came across somehow a man who was anointed for a specific work also in the Old Testament, who was anointed with all sorts of skills and ability to design and make the temple. Does anybody know what his name is? Bezalel. Does anybody know what Bezalel's name means in the Hebrew? I don't even know why I asked that, because I didn't know. But thankfully I looked in the Strongs. It means in the shadow of God. What a lovely name that is, in the shadow of God. So as I'm talking about coming out of the shadow, really the whole emphasis of this sermon is to actually come out of shadows that may hinder you, but actually come in to the shadow of the God. And in a sense, we'll be talking about that, really following the dust, or being covered in the dust of the Rabbi Jesus, instead of being hindered by your past and things like that. So it was, the thing that I focused on mainly was actually the word shadow. And I thought, okay, this is how I feel right now. I don't know if you feel that way. I feel like I'm in the shadows a little bit with all the training that I've had. Some of you know, some of you may not know, that I used to be an evangelist, or I still am an evangelist, but now I do the work of an evangelist, or that's what I'm supposed to do. But that was my heart, to be out in the town, to share faith with people. Peter as well, we've been there, haven't we? We've been in the front line battling together, and Denise. But it's a bit of a shock when I started training at college, when I started to put my head in books. So it's kind of like, I'm going to talk about that later, being in the shadow of preparation. And now I've come to an end, I'm thinking, okay, now really is a time for me to step out of the shadow of preparation. I don't know if that makes sense, but it made sense to me. Step out and be the man that you want me to be, Lord. And it was really Paul's charge to Timothy. I really felt that was a word specifically for me. So he was saying, like, in a day, if you only have to see the news, you only have to look at the papers. I mean, this morning I got, in California, I think now a preacher can't even talk about LGBT or homosexuality, because actually they would then be charged with hate speech. There was another woman who is commanded by a judge to have a termination. And I thought, what world are we living in? And I can understand when the Apostle Paul told Timothy, he said, look, in the last days, it's going to be terrible times. People will be lovers of themselves. And he goes on this list of all sorts of wicked things happening. False teachers leading people astray. People having itchy ears, going around churches to find teachers that will agree with what they're saying. And that's the time we live in. A complicated term is moral relativism. That's what we live in now. There's no objective truth. There's no truth. And that's why I think Paul was charging Timothy. And I think that's why God is saying to me, come out of the shadows now. Preach the word. In season, out season. Be ready. Rebuke, instruct, and all that stuff. So he's saying, look, in a time now is your chance to stand up and be a voice amongst the secularism in our world, in our society. And this is for me, this word, but I believe that God has a word for you too. Now, you might not be called to preach the word in season, out season. You might be called to be a good neighbour. Well, you are called to be that because God says so, but to your neighbours, to be a witness to your family, to be a witness at work, and so forth. And maybe God is saying, okay, come on, come out of the shadows now. Now it's time for you to come out of the shadows, or us to come out of the shadows and be all that God wanted us to be, a woman and a man of God. And that's good news, isn't it? So I designed an acronym. It's a really good one. Ready? Perper. It's a good one, isn't it? Sorry, I couldn't find Perper. Don't write that down, please. And don't quote me on it either. So firstly, I think, the first thing I want to talk about is coming out of the shadow of fear. The second thing I wanted to talk about is coming out of the shadow of others. That's an interesting one, isn't it? That's the O. And then the third one is coming out of the shadow of others, but also coming out the shadow of preparation. And we'll talk about Timothy there. And then the last one, which is really important, is coming out the shadow of your past. And that's a big one for me at the moment because I so much hold on to it. So the first one, coming out of the shadow of, do you remember what it was? Fear. Now I was brought, and I'm going to use 4 different characters from the Bible here. The first one is Nicodemus. He was a man who was intrigued by the Rabbi Jesus. So intrigued, he went at night, you could say he was in the shadows at night, wanting to meet with this rabbi to understand what he was all about. So he met with him at night, and Jesus met with him and then sort of taught him, and he was saying things like, you know, you're a teacher of Israel and you don't know what I'm talking about. But really, he didn't make that step of faith to say, actually, I believe this man. He was intrigued by Jesus. He knew there was something special about him. And then we know in the Sanhedrin, he would say things like, he would stand up in a way that wasn't too confrontational. He would say, and I think he was being wise, he would say things like, well, this man has not been charged. Shouldn't we hear him first before we charge him? And then they start to rebuke him. But does anybody else know at other time where he's mentioned in the Gospels where Jesus was buried, Joseph of Arimathea went and took to prepare him, and then it's Nicodemus shows up again, coming alongside. So when I see Nicodemus, he never really came out. He may have come out of the shadow of fear. Fear what others think of him. A fear of being rebuked by the Pharisees. Perhaps he was in fear of actually being exiled from the Pharisees, from his job as a Pharisee. He never quite came out the shadow of fear. Now, I would say this to us. What does that mean to us? I think it means actually there are some people, I'm not sure if there's anyone in this room, that may be intrigued by Jesus, that may see Christ in other people like Helen, I see Christ in you. They may see Christ in you and you're attracted by that, but you haven't quite come out of the shadow of that fear, of what it's all about. And as I was at the gathering, that's what it was all about. It was men who were struggling with this, and now is the time to rise up and come out and say, I'm for Jesus. Coming out of the shadow of fear. And, you know, there are going to be things, there are going to be people, your family, your friends who might ridicule for your faith. But so what? So what? Jesus promised that it's not going to be easy. He said it's going to be a cost. So that's my first thing to you, is coming out of the shadow of fear. The second one, and this might get a little bit complicated, I hope I'm not being too complicated with it, is coming out the shadow of others. Now in 2 Kings, there was a king of Judah. His name was Ahaziah. Now he died, and he had a mother called Athaliah. Now she wasn't a particularly nice woman. In fact, when he died, she wanted, or she actually did, usurp the throne in Judea. She usurped it so much so that she did try to kill every heir to the throne. Can you imagine that? Because she wanted to remain in power. Now, thankfully, there was this woman who was actually a daughter of the king of Israel, Joram. Her name was Jehosheba. Say it, Jehosheba, just so you're keeping up with me. Jehosheba. Now, she hid the little heir to the throne. His name was Joash. She hid him when he was a baby. And she hid him in the house of the Lord. Now, thankfully for that, now later on when he was 7 years old, there was a priest named Jehoiada. Say Jehoiada. Sorry, I did spend some time going through these names to learn them. Jehoiada, the priest. And what he did is he got commanders from each army, armies of hundreds, commanders of hundreds, and he got him to crowd around Joash because he was going to crown him king. He was going to anoint him king because she had some power left, you see. So he's walking in there with all of the army commanders, the best he's got, walking into there. And then he crowns him king and he anoints him with oil. Now, Athaliah, she shouts out one word twice. Treason! Treason! That's what she shouts. So Jehoiada then commanded that she be taken outside, and guess what? She was executed. She was executed. Now, why am I saying all this? This builds up the context of the story, because Joash was under the shadow of others. He was under the shadow of Jehoiada, who was a good priest. Now, while he was under his shadow, it says that Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord. He was a good king. But Jehoiada died when he was about 100, I think it was 131. Now, while he was under Jehoiada, he started to rebuild and repair the temple, because she had used some of the stuff to worship Baal and put Asherah poles and stuff like that. But when she died, he then listened to the officials in Judea. And they kind of led him away, and he then stopped all the reparation of the temple, and he started to worship at Asherah poles. That's I'm not quite sure what they are, but they're worshipping on different altars, serving the god of Baal. And obviously his heart was turned because he was listening to these officials. He no longer had Jehoiada to look out for him, to lead him and to guide him. And ultimately, Jehoiada's son came and prophesied against him, but then he had him killed. I think his name was Zechariah, which was awful. He eventually got injured in battle. He laid on his bed, and because of recompense for the death of Jehoiada's son, they slain him where he was in his bed. Now, why am I saying this? Because Joash lived in the shadow of others. And I think we're in danger of that, aren't we? Maybe there's someone, a mentor, been in your life that has led you and moved you forward, and while they're there, you're okay. But sometime or other, you're going to have to stand up for your own faith. Now, this is true with you children as well. You can't rely on your mother or your father's faith. I say that to Scout. She's getting to the age now where she has to express her faith herself. She cannot rely on me. She has to seek and follow God with all her heart herself. And maybe there's others. I know, those perhaps have had people that have passed on. Those have had people who have moved away. You don't want to rely on their faith. Now it's time for you to come out of the shadow of other people and be the man and woman that God has intended you to be. Does that make sense? Yes. So really, coming out of the shadow of fear, coming out of the shadow of others, and expressing that faith yourself is so important, I think. Now, the third one, does anyone remember what that was? Perper, remember my great acronym? Coming out of the shadow of preparation. Now, this one is for me, but it may be for you too. Now, this is Timothy. Now, Timothy wasn't he may not have been under the shadow of preparation, because I think he was at work. But he was also under the shadow of others. So, Timothy had a grandmother. Does anybody remember what her name was? Eunice, I think it was, wasn't it? Sorry? Yeah, I forget her name. Sorry, I should have remembered. Anyway, Paul says, look, your faith that was in your grandmother, your faith that is in your mother, that faith is in you. So he's kind of reminding him, look, actually you have that faith as well, and I want you now to grab a hold of that. And then he said this also, he said, look, you've been taught the Holy Scriptures from a young age. Now it's time to bring all of that knowledge and wealth of knowledge into practice. And then he goes on in a minute. And then he says also this, remember when I laid my hands on you. Remember when you were prophesied over. And what man of God that you're going to be. He's saying, look, all of this, now it's time to fan into flame that gift when I laid your hands on you. Now it's your time to come out of the shadow of others, to come out of the shadow of preparation and be the man of God that you want me to be. And that was for me, because I'm like, okay, I've been preparing all this time, and God is saying, come on, now it's time to move out of those shadows of learning, of preparation. I know we constantly learn. I know and we are constantly preparing ourselves. Don't mishear me or misquote me. But he's saying now is the time for action. Now is the time for you to be a voice in this, I suppose, wicked and adulterous generation, to preach the word in season, out season. And that's God's word for me. So I suppose I try to think that you might think this as well. If God is speaking to you to come out of the shadows, what does that mean for you? What word is the Lord giving you? But how does that play out in application? So for me, it's okay, we've got Sundays where I can teach, we've got life groups where we can teach, but how does that play out in the community? How can I preach the word in season, out season without rubbing people up the wrong way in the community. So I'm sure if I was down on the green preaching every day, I think probably I'll get thrown out of this church, probably. Thrown in the river, probably. How does that play out? So I'm thinking, okay, I can use things like YouTube, social media and stuff like that, but we can also do things. How can we equip others to do the same? There might be men and women in here who want to express their gift in that way. There might not be. So if God is speaking to you, how is that going to play out in your life when you come out of the shadows? But the last one is, remember Perper, brilliant acronym, coming out of the shadows or stepping out of the shadows of your past. Now, I'm going to use Paul here. Now, Paul, he said that he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He said he was blameless in the oral law and the written law. He says he was. He was a man of great status, a man who was revered. Perhaps people bowed to him or kissed his hand when they saw him, this great Pharisee. Now, he's got an old life there. Now his life, he's saying, look, I'm persecuted, I'm stripped naked, I'm in the sea, I'm whipped, I'm stoned. And he had to make that transition from old life. And this really ties in with what the Botels were praying over us a couple of weeks ago. Stepping out of our old clothes into the new clothes, Paul had to come away from that power, that status, and actually step into, he called that all rubbish for the sake of knowing Christ. So really it's coming out of the shadow of your past life. And I think where I struggle, I have to remind myself, I had a life, bear in mind, before, but it was a different life. I lived with my partner for 11 years and we lived together on a farm, built up business. I have to say, okay, I have to come out of that. I have to walk out of those shadows. Sometimes I do feel that I'm still in there, even though I'm not there. And I'm just being honest with you this morning. And that might be something that you need to do, is to come out of your past life and come into those new clothes which God has ordained for you. But Paul also, remember he said this, he had something else to deal with. He said, I was a persecutor, a violent man. So he really persecuted the church of God. I don't know if anyone's seen that film, The Apostle Paul, where it shows him, I don't know if this is true, but it shows him killing one of the men in front of his daughter. That's not biblical, by the way, but it reminded me of the shame and the guilt that Paul had to deal with, which probably was his thorn in the flesh, a constant Satan bringing up that guilt and that shame, saying, who do you think you are? Calling yourself a man of God when all you did was persecute Jesus and his body. You can imagine that must have come to his mind time and time again. So really, God is saying to you not only to come out of your past life, be the person that God wants you to be, but actually there is no shame, there is no condemnation. I'm not going to go on a list of sins now, but I have done the most abhorrent things in my past. I can really associate with Paul when he says, I am the worst of sinners, because that's what I feel like. But that's my past life. Now it's time to come in to all that God has for me. And that means forgiveness. That means I am a child of the King. That means, I love that verse, that his mercies are new every day for me. So even when I mess up, he's saying, look, here's a fresh start for you, a chance to serve me and to be the person that I want you to be. So those things, you've got fear, you've got coming out the shadow of others, you've got coming out the shadows of preparation, you've got coming out the shadows of the past. Now this, we're going to go full circle. This comes back to Bezalel. Now what does it mean, come out of the shadows of the past? Being in the shadow of God is a good thing. And that's whose shadow we want to be under. So today I'm praying that all these things, whether these list of things you feeling God is speaking to you, now it's time for you to come out of those shadows and come under the shadow of God yourself. Come from fear to faith. Come from learning and preparation to action, following the Messiah. Remember, in the Jewish customs, it was following a rabbi was to be covered in the dust of his feet. So you were so close that you would get filthy from his dust. It reminds you of a shadow, doesn't it? So God is saying to you, now is the time for you personally to follow me, to hear my voice, to come under the shadow of me, and you'll have my protection. And that's what it means. Bezalel, he was called, he was anointed by God, filled with the Holy Spirit for a specific task. Creativity, skills, talents, discipline, all those things that he needed to do the job that God had ordained him to do, God will provide that for each one of you as you come out of those shadows that hinder you, but into the shadow of God. And that's what Bezalel's name means. So I'm going to leave it there, just have a bit of quiet, and we're going to pray into that.